About 55% of Russians want peace talks with Ukraine, while 25% said they are in favor of the war continuing. Independent Russian media outlet Meduza reported on a secret Kremlin opinion poll on November 30th. As the war has gone on, Russians and Ukrainians' feelings about the war have obviously evolved. In Ukraine, though, that evolution has usually been they've become more and more steadfast. At the start of the war, there was a lot of fear about Ukraine collapsing, whether Kiev would be taken, whether cities like Kharkiv would be taken. Thankfully, most locations were not captured, and most of the early war doomsday predictions did not come to pass. And as the war continued to go on, and the war crimes of the Russian army were broadcasted for the world to see, whether it was the mass graves in Bucha, or the executions, or the rapes, or the bodies uncovered at Izium, every time one of these crimes from Russian soldiers would be uncovered, it would further strengthen the Ukrainian will to fight. And all the polling data, both for the former months earlier in this war all the way up today, seems to suggest that the majority of Ukrainians still want to continue the fight until every inch of Ukraine is liberated. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying, oh, we get back to 2014 lines. I'm not saying, oh, we take back just Donetsk and Luhansk. I'm saying the vast majority of Ukrainians, the last number I saw was like 80% of Ukrainians, around 80% of Ukrainians, want to move towards recapturing all of Ukraine, including Crimea. And that data has genuinely stayed in the positive range of between like the high 70s and the high 80s. It's been in that range for the majority of the war. And it still is in that range. But Russian perspective about the war has continued to change. Now, there's a problem inherent when it comes to polling Russians where, there's a question of like how much is fear of response from the state impacting what they're saying about peace negotiations and the war and their views of it and their views of Vladimir Putin. This has been a problem that pollsters that have tried to do work in Russia and work in many different nations that have an authoritarian bent have ran into. And so it's kind of difficult to really read a ton into these polling data, but you can still use it to have some ideas about general trends, because you'll still, even if the numbers aren't exactly accurate, you'll still see the numbers go up during certain periods, and you'll still see the numbers go down across the board, across all posters, including the ones that aren't just shills for the government. And recently, we got some polling data out of Russia that was pretty interesting. More than half of Russians want peace talks with Ukraine, according to a secret opinion poll. Let's read the article. About 55% of Russians want peace talks with Ukraine, while 25% said they are in favor of the war continuing. Independent Russian media outlet Meduza reported on a secret Kremlin opinion poll on November 30th. The Russian authorities have noted a decline in public support of the war and amid constant defeats and mobilization, Meduza said. According to the results of the survey, Russians' attitude to the war changed recently. A survey conducted in July of 2020 showed that only 30% of the Russians wanted peace in Ukraine. So the thing is, the reason why, well, let me finish the article. Meduza sources who are close to the Russian dictator's administration said that was the reason the Kremlin decided to limit the holding of public opinion polls of Russian attitudes towards the invasion of Ukraine. However, the sources also said they don't believe that anti-war rallies were coming to Russia in the near future. Still, they believed it would be better not to escalate the situation or irritate people, Meduza said. Now, even if this isn't like a poll saying the majority of Russians think they should just like leave or they should give up or that the war is doomed or anything like that, you can see a distinct change in the percentage of Russians who used to be like, we need to keep fighting this war until we take the capital, until we get rid of all the Banderites, until we get rid of Zelensky's regime, and we cleanse Ukraine of their transness and their homosexual degeneracy that is investing it from the West, and all this nonsense. That seemed to be what the rhetoric on Russian state TV was for the early parts of the war. If you looked at Russia's government statements, like, for example, Vladimir Putin's statements at the beginning of the war, his speeches and his essays, he wrote justifications for basically the reclaiming of all of Ukraine. That Ukraine could not exist outside of the Russian sphere. That is what he said. It was impossible for Ukraine to exist outside of the Russian sphere of influence, and that Ukraine was created artificially by Lenin. And that the Soviet Union was so nice and kind to Ukraine, and that Russia took on all these debts. And they basically wrote up a justification that could be used to not only conduct a regime change war across all of Ukraine, but possibly even annexations, which they went on to do, to try to fulfill this dream of the foretold quote-unquote Novorossiya, which sees large swaths of territory being annexed by Russia. Now, as the war has gone on, and it went on, it expanded from like, oh, just a quick military operation, a special military operation is going to be quick. Hey, if you call it a war, you might go in the slammer. You can get 15 years for calling this a war. Don't say it, because this is just a quick military operation. Well, it's been over 275 days now. The week-long to a few weeks long to a few months long war extended to a much larger and longer conflict. And the Russian public were not really prepared too much heading into this war for something of this, scale. And so I think a lot of that early patriotic fervor for, yes, we're going to take on the Banderites or whatever, really, I don't even think they sold the war, period, to the population. This is one of the most soulless, meaningless wars of the 21st century. That population, now 9 months on, 10 months on, is coming to the realization of, shit, this war isn't going away, is it? We kept hearing, on the first day of the war, the Russians said, and they said this on state media, that they disabled 100% of Ukraine's air force. 100% of it. So if you're a Russian civilian, you believe day one, it's over. We just destroyed all of their air force. The end is near. Then a few months later, Ukraine is conducting air raids into Belgorod. Ukraine is still operating aircraft. Russia, 75 days in, still don't have air superiority over Ukraine. And so if you're a Russian who at the start was told, we disabled all of Ukraine's air force, and 275 days later, there's still Ukrainian jets in the air, still Ukrainian helicopters, and still Ukrainian anti-air shooting down Russian planes. Russians still don't have air superiority. No matter how much the government attempts to make you erase your critical thinking skills, eventually, if the government's not careful enough, people are going to start asking questions. Definitely after mobilization occurred. Because, the Russians said at the start of this war that there would not be any mobilization. And then there was mobilization. And a bunch of people who didn't want to go started fleeing the country en masse, or being forced to fight in the front lines of this war with very little training, and according to a lot of videos that came out, pretty piss poor equipment. And this is all on top of the fact that the Russian economy is really suffering here. We're seeing massive reductions in GDP for construction and technology sectors and consumer goods, and especially the automobile industry. And we're seeing 40% of Russian airliners grounded because they just can't replace the parts. And a lot of people are losing their jobs because companies are pulling out. We've seen a real reduction in GDP in Russia, a real reduction in jobs available for a lot of people because these jobs are fleeing out of the country. And so Russians see the situation where they were told day one, going to be a quick operation, no mobilization, took out all their air force, don't worry about it. 275 days later, no air superiority. Your brother and your father just got sent over to die in Ukraine, while your cousin fled the country because he didn't want to be thrown into a meat grinder. Your economy's in the shitter, and the war has literally zero end in sight as your soldiers are freezing on the front lines to death with astronomically high casualty rates. And the Russians have achieved basically none of their war goals. And not only have they achieved none of their war goals, they've been getting pushed back. They lost the battle for Kupiansk during the Kharkiv counteroffensive. They lost the battle for Lyman, and they recently lost the only provincial capital. They captured the entire war after the recapturing of Kherson. And the Russians were pushed over the river. In these conditions, is it so surprising that more and more Russians are clamoring for peace? Is it? Is it that surprising? If you were told for 275 days that victory is just around the corner, but each day you see more and more of your neighbors sent off to die, your job taken away, destroyed because the company pulled out. You're seeing a lot of your family members flee the country. You're finding out that a bunch of stuff the government told you ended up being a lie, ended up being false. You're finding out that millions of winter uniforms are disappearing, and your government's corruption has led to people basically having to start GoFundMes and fundraise, just have basic equipment, basic medical gear before going to the front line, making your class a determinant on whether you get to live and die if you get shot. Is it really surprising that the Russian people are clamoring for peace? And that's all while the meaning of this war, I mean, this is an extremely meaningless war. Outside of just hardcore Russian chauvinism, there's not a lot of meaning to this war. It's like, for example, think of the symbol that embodies this war, the Z symbol. They scrambled to grab onto some artificial meaning, and so they grabbed onto the Z symbol, something so soulless and meaningless. It's just a military indicator. But they grabbed onto it because they needed something to symbolize the war effort. And they got the letter Z. It's not that surprising that support for the war is dropping and support for peace is increasing. Now, I don't want to get your guys' hopes up. As the article states, just because more and more Russians are realizing that peace with Ukraine would probably be better for their daily lives than war in Ukraine, and that the end in sight is not in the near future, and they're actually taking a bunch of L's, that doesn't necessarily mean that the peace agreement that they would want, that more and more of them now want, the majority of Russians want to negotiate a peace talk right now, that peace talk would necessarily be, their terms would be the same as Ukrainian terms. Because I'm sure if we broke this down by, would you be willing to accept peace with Ukraine if Ukraine got back all of the territory they've captured so far in this war, you're probably going to see the number go down a bit. Then if you add, they need to give back Donbass and Luhansk, Luhansk and Donetsk, probably go down further. Give back Crimea, probably go down a lot more. A lot more. But this clamoring for peace is increasing. And this is a problem for the Putin administration, because in his eyes, their goal to win right now, at least through the winter, at least one of the strategies you're trying to use, is basically just freezing the Ukrainians into submission. The plan is to use their missiles and Iranian provided drones to disable Ukrainian heat, to disable Ukrainian electricity, so people, feel the real suffering of this Ukrainian winter, and then Russia is able to use their old ally, Father Winter, to freeze the Ukrainians into submission. But so far, these types of terror campaigns have not worked in making the Ukrainians submit. And from my personal conversations, from all the polling data I've seen, and from what is just blatantly obvious to anyone paying attention, every time Russia engages in some sort of terror campaign against the Ukrainians, that does nothing more but harden their resolve. This is a lesson we've learned a long time ago. Just look at the Battle of Britain, as the Nazis started to prioritize more and more bombing civilian targets and terror campaigns instead of bombing, strategically important targets. Did that make the British submit? Did that make them call for mercy? No. They buckled down and they got through the war and they ended up winning. And I think for many Ukrainians, they view it in a very similar way. That this is going to be a very tough winter, but they're going to get through it. And let's also be clear, even if the Russians are using winter as a weapon of war, winter is an indiscriminate opponent. Oh boy, is it indiscriminate. Let me tell you, I've seen so much footage of Russian soldiers huddled together in these Arctic temperatures that are descending upon parts of Ukraine, where they're on the front line with very little winter clothing, very little protection, piss poor equipment, and they're huddled together because they don't want to freeze to death. And I've seen videos where these guys are getting bombed, huddled together, and some of them just don't even move because they're just so frozen and so cold, or they move so slowly because the frostbite is taking them. Is that all Russian soldiers? No. But 1.5 million Russian uniforms, winter uniforms, did disappear, and it was revealed during this war because, corruption. We had Russian, depot commanders or whatever selling the stuff out of the backs of trucks, and now the Russian soldiers are paying the price for it. And unless they got, like a few $100 to go spent on winter uniforms and medical gear, they're not going to have all the proper equipment. A lot of these soldiers, that's the conditions they're facing. And so what I'm trying to get at is that I do believe that Russia's tactics to try to break the Ukrainian will to fight is only doing the exact opposite. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that Russia has less of a will to fight than Ukraine. If you were to ask a Russian, why will you go to Ukraine to fight and die? I don't know, maybe the Banderites? Well, I don't know. Like, you're kind of getting drafted here and sent off in conscription. A lot of them don't even want to be there. A lot of Russians are just fleeing the country. But you go to a Ukrainian and you ask them why they're fighting to protect their country. They're fighting to protect their homeland. They're fighting to stop the annexation of their territory. They're fighting to make sure that Bucha does not descend upon their village, their community. I'm sure there's Russians who believe they're fighting to protect their country from NATO as well, but that unified feeling of terror and we must fight against the invader, that's dominant on the Ukrainian side. Not as dominant on the Russian side. And the reason is simple. Ukrainians can see the bombs hitting their villages. Ukrainians can see the suffering descending upon their communities. Russians, they don't see no bombs on their communities. They don't see no Ukrainian soldiers rounding them up and shooting them. They don't see that. And so for them, this NATO threat, Ukrainian threat, just probably is more distant. And therefore, probably for a lot of them, just not as worth it. I think the Ukrainian will to fight is stronger. And I think the Russians are slowly realizing that this war is not sustainable forever. So the Russians have to find some way out or some way to get a quick victory. Problem is, there is no quick victory around the corner. And so more and more Russians are looking towards what might be the inevitable conclusion that they're not going to get the victory they originally wanted. They're not going to take Kiev. They're not going to take they're not going to take Lviv. They're not going to replace the government. And they're going to have to settle. And you know what? That settlement might be even the complete expulsion of Russian soldiers from Ukraine. It's going to be a hard pill to swallow. They haven't swallowed the pill yet, but they're at least looking at it now. It doesn't take much will to send a couple of hundred cheap drones to destroy infrastructure. Ukraine will be unable to function normally until they get Russia to agree to stop drone attacks. They can keep it up for years. I mean, it depends, because this is the thing. I think you're assuming that Ukraine can't attempt to adapt. But from my conversations with people who specialize in this type of stuff, like study it, like it's some reporters with the Daily Beast who like study drone warfare, Ukrainians have actually tried to plug the gaps with like some old war tactics. They're taking old Cold War anti-air weapons that are no longer effective against planes because planes fly a lot higher now, and they're actually or not as effective against planes, and they're using those to shoot down drones. There is the moral calculus being made of like, do we fire an extremely expensive drone, extremely expensive anti-air drone at a $20,000 drone, extremely expensive anti-air weapon at a generally cheap drone? But I think the Ukrainians will adapt. I absolutely think they will adapt. And the hardcore impact of this campaign when it comes to like weather conditions are going to be felt less and less as springtime comes around. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about this quickly because, you know, I hadn't checked in a while on the polling data in Russia. This is the first time I've seen it go above 55%. So I think we really are seeing a real surge change. Does that mean we're going to see massive anti-war protests in the near future? No. I think it's going to take some more Russian defeats on the battlefield to produce anything like that. I think there's going to have to be a straw to break the camel's back, so to speak. Also, I don't know if you guys saw this, but people were sending mail packages to Ukrainian embassies that had like animals' eyes in them. I don't know. I don't know. Ukrainian embassies and consulates in 6 European countries have received packages containing animals' eyes in recent days. Foreign Ministry spokesman Olia Nicolo wrote on Facebook that the bloody parcels were received by Ukrainian embassies in Hungary, the Netherlands, Poland, Croatia, and Italy, as well as by consulates in Nepal, Italy, Krakow, Poland, and the Czech city of Brno. He said that we are studying the meaning of this message. It's a very strong signal, the Ukrainian consuls in Nepal confirmed his office Thursday. 2 letters containing fish eyes arrived around 10:30 a.m. Thursday. He said the parcels arrived after a package containing an explosive device sent to the Ukrainian embassy in Madrid ignited upon opening on Wednesday and injured an employee. Wow! That was one of multiple explosive parcels found in Spain this week. Wow, I feel like this didn't get any news coverage. I didn't even hear of this. This is the... Wow, really? Did any of you guys hear about this? Yeah, I see somebody bringing it up in chat right now. In Spain, they sent letter bombs to the Ukrainian embassy, U.S. embassy, and various Spanish ministries. Wait, you missed that? I read this from another article. I'm using The Hill now. They didn't say this in The Hill. I mean, in the other article. In Ukraine, it was big news. I missed it. I completely missed it. Maybe I got too distracted by the Donda and Kanye. Who knows? Spain's Interior Ministry said police evacuated the Madrid embassies on Friday after another suspect package was detected. The ministry said the parcel was posted from outside Spain and might be part of a chain of mail sent to other embassies in Europe. Police were investigating the contents and did not find any explosives, the ministry said. Elsewhere, the entrance into the residence of Ukrainian ambassador to the Vatican was vandalized. The Ukrainian embassy in Kazakhstan was warned of an attack with explosives, though that was not confirmed. In Poland, a spokesperson for the police in Warsaw confirmed by email that the package arrived at the Ukrainian consulate in the Polish capital on Thursday that raised concerns from one of the employees. The police department for protecting the diplomatic mission was notified, and we quickly eliminated the danger. He provided no further details. He said he was not aware of any such parcel arriving at the Ukrainian embassy in Warsaw. Man. Dude, this shit's fucking wild. And the thing is, can I be for real? As much as the overwhelming majority of people in the world and in Europe support Ukraine, the people who don't, many of them are very, very, very hateful. And I mean very hateful, as you can see from these like attempted bombings and fucking like sending of like bloody animal eyes. I don't know where they got the animal eyes. And I think a lot of time, like I almost feel like we're seeing more. Okay, let me put it this way. I've seen the most anti-Ukrainian bigotry in my life ever since this war started. Before this war, I didn't know any of these slurs for Ukrainians. Did you guys know these slurs for Ukrainians? Before these wars, I didn't see every Ukrainian talked about as like little Russians and like all of this. This isn't the dialogue I saw. This is something that has come with this war. Whether we like it or not, I'm seeing more and more pro Russian establishment, anti-Ukrainian, just bigotry, propaganda being consumed by Americans, and then they're repeating like words and slurs for Ukrainians that like they shouldn't even know, and they weren't using before this war. And so we're at a great opportunity to learn new slurs. Yeah, sure. yeah. All I'm saying is, like, as much as Ukraine has gotten a lot of support, and, you know, they talk so much about Russophobia, the Russians do, let's be blunt. Ukrainians are having bombs shipped to their embassies across Europe. They're having, like, weird animal threats directed at them with animal carcasses. They are having slurs thrown at them, and they are being assaulted throughout Europe. Not to mention that even though they didn't get the same reaction as, like, refugees from Syria did, I wish the Syrian refugees were more accepted, they are getting some backlash from the far right in many of these countries, like the far right in Poland and the far right in many other European countries, who blame the Ukrainian refugees for a lot of their societal ills, even though it's not any of their fault. So I just wanted to like cover this for a second, because I know like Russophobia gets covered like a lot. It gets talked about a lot, but not as much like this anti-Ukrainian hate that is also existent in Europe due to the prevalence of Russian propaganda.